What you're about to hear happened in the endless wilderness of Montana, where cell towers don't reach and help is hundreds of miles away. These aren't just ghost stories told around campfires. These are real accounts from people who survived something in those mountains that shouldn't exist. Something that turned their peaceful camping trips into living nightmares. If you're planning a trip to Montana's backcountry, you might want to think twice after hearing what happened to Sarah and her friends last October. Sarah Martinez had been planning this camping trip for months. After working 60-hour weeks at her accounting firm in Billings, she desperately needed to escape into Montana's pristine wilderness. She'd convinced her 3 closest friends to join her for what was supposed to be a relaxing weekend in the Beartooth Mountains, just south of Red Lodge. "Come on, guys, when's the last time we actually disconnected from everything?" Sarah had argued during their planning meeting at her apartment. No phones, no internet, no work emails. Just us, the mountains, and some serious bonding time. Her friend Jessica, a nurse who'd been pulling double shifts at the hospital, was the first to agree. "I'm so burned out, I can't even remember what silence sounds like anymore." Mike, Sarah's college roommate and now a high school teacher, nodded enthusiastically. "I've been showing my students pictures of Montana wilderness all semester. Time I actually experienced it myself instead of just talking about it." The 4th member of their group, David, was more hesitant. A local boy who'd grown up in Red Lodge, he knew the mountains better than any of them. "Look, I love camping as much as anyone, but October's getting pretty late in the season. Weather can turn nasty real quick up there." But Sarah was determined. She'd already booked the time off work, bought new camping gear, and researched the perfect spot. "David, you know these mountains like the back of your hand. We need your expertise. Besides, the weather forecast is perfect. Clear skies all weekend." That Friday afternoon in mid-October, they loaded up Sarah's SUV with enough supplies for 3 days. Tents, sleeping bags, camp stoves, food, and water filled every available space. The drive from Billings to their chosen trailhead took nearly 3 hours, winding through increasingly remote mountain roads. As they climbed higher into the Beartooth Range, the landscape became more dramatic. Pine forests gave way to alpine meadows, and massive granite peaks stretched toward a brilliant blue sky. Sarah felt her stress melting away with each mile they traveled from civilization. "This is exactly what I needed," she said, rolling down her window to breathe in the crisp mountain air. "Look at this place. It's like something out of a postcard." David, riding shotgun, was studying their topographic map. "We'll park at the Hell-Roaring Creek trailhead and hike about 4 miles in. There's a beautiful meadow beside a lake where we can set up camp. Pretty remote. Probably won't see another soul all weekend." By late afternoon, they'd reached the trailhead. The parking area was completely empty except for their vehicle. A wooden sign marked the beginning of the Hell-Roaring Creek Trail, warning hikers about bear safety and the need for proper preparation. Sarah snapped a selfie with her friends in front of the sign before shouldering her backpack. The hike started easily enough, following a well-maintained trail through dense pine forest. The air was thin at this elevation, nearly 8,000 feet, and they had to stop frequently to catch their breath. But the scenery was breathtaking. Massive peaks surrounded them on all sides, their snow-capped summits glowing pink in the late afternoon light. "I can't believe we live in Montana and don't do this more often," Jessica said, stopping to photograph a small waterfall cascading down a rocky cliff face. As they hiked deeper into the wilderness, the trail became less defined. David led the way, consulting his map and compass regularly. The forest seemed to close in around them, blocking out much of the sky. Strange rock formations jutted up through the trees, twisted spires of granite that looked almost like frozen screams. "How much further?" Mike asked after they'd been hiking for nearly 2 hours. His new boots were giving him blisters, and the heavy pack was making his shoulders ache. "Maybe another hour," David replied, though he looked less certain than he had earlier. "The trail's not as clear as I remembered. Might have gotten overgrown since I was last up here." As the sun began to set, they finally emerged from the forest into a large alpine meadow. A pristine lake reflected the surrounding peaks like a perfect mirror. The sight took Sarah's breath away. It was even more beautiful than she'd imagined. "This is it," she whispered. "This is perfect." They quickly set up camp as darkness fell. 4 small tents arranged in a circle around their fire pit, with the lake just 50 yards away. David built a fire while the others prepared dinner. Nothing fancy, just dehydrated camping meals. But they tasted incredible after the long hike. As they sat around the crackling fire, sharing stories and laughing, Sarah felt completely at peace for the first time in months. The stars were brighter than she'd ever seen them, and the only sounds were the gentle lapping of water against the shore and the distant call of an owl. "You know what?" she said, raising her camp cup of hot chocolate in a toast. "This is exactly what friendship is about. Getting away from all the chaos and just being together." But as the fire died down to glowing embers, David noticed something that made his stomach tighten with unease. Along the far shore of the lake, just at the edge of their firelight, something had been watching them. He'd caught movement out of the corner of his eye several times during dinner, but when he looked directly, there was nothing there. He decided not to mention it to the others. They were having such a good time, and it was probably just a deer or elk coming down to drink. Mountain animals were naturally curious about human activity. Still, as they prepared for bed, David made sure to secure all their food in bear-proof containers and hang them from a tree branch well away from their tents. Sweet dreams. "Everyone!" Sarah called out as they settled into their sleeping bags. "Tomorrow we'll explore more of the area. Maybe hike up to that ridge and get some amazing photos." But sleep didn't come easily for any of them. The mountain wilderness was far from silent. Strange sounds echoed across the lake. Splashing that was too rhythmic to be natural. Snapping branches that suggested something large moving through the forest. And worst of all, a sound that might have been voices calling to each other in the distance. David lay awake in his tent, listening intently. He'd spent countless nights camping in these mountains, and he knew the normal sounds of the wilderness. What he was hearing now was different. It was wrong somehow, in a way that made his skin crawl and his heart race. Around 2 a.m, the sound stopped completely. The sudden silence was even more unnerving than the strange noises had been. It was as if the entire mountain was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Sarah woke to complete silence. After growing up in the city, she'd expected the mountains to be quiet, but this was different. It was the kind of absolute silence that felt heavy and oppressive, like a thick blanket had been thrown over the entire wilderness. She checked her watch. 3:17 a.m. Her sleeping bag was damp with sweat despite the cold mountain air, and her heart was pounding for reasons she couldn't understand. She'd been having the strangest dream about something calling her name from across the lake, but now she couldn't remember the details. A soft scratching sound outside her tent made her freeze. It sounded like fingernails dragging across the nylon fabric, starting at the bottom and moving slowly upward. The sound stopped right at head level, and Sarah could swear she felt something pressing against the tent wall just inches from her face. She held her breath, not daring to move. The scratching resumed, more insistent now, as if whatever was outside was trying to claw its way in. Then she heard David's voice, barely above a whisper, coming from the tent next to hers. "Sarah, you awake? There's something out here." The scratching stopped immediately, as if whatever was making the sound had heard David speak. Sarah carefully unzipped her sleeping bag and crawled toward her tent entrance. Through the mesh window, she could see the dying embers of their campfire casting strange shadows across the meadow. "I'm awake," she whispered back. "What did you see?" "I don't know." "Something big. It was standing by the lake about 10 minutes ago, just watching our camp. When I sat up to get a better look, it moved into the tree line." Jessica's voice joined the whispered conversation from her tent on the other side of the fire. "I heard it too. It sounded like footsteps, but wrong somehow. Too heavy, and they were coming from different directions, like there was more than one." Mike's tent remained silent, and Sarah felt a chill of fear that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "Mike?" she called softly. "Mike, are you okay?" No response. "His tent's right there," David whispered. "I can see it from here." "Mike, wake up, man!" Still nothing. Sarah could see Mike's tent clearly now that her eyes had adjusted to the darkness. It looked normal enough, but something about it seemed wrong. The shape was slightly off, as if it had been disturbed or partially collapsed. "We need to check on him," Jessica said, and Sarah could hear the fear in her friend's voice. David was already moving. Sarah watched through her tent window as he carefully unzipped his tent entrance and stepped outside. He'd grabbed a flashlight, but he kept it pointed toward the ground, casting just enough light to see where he was stepping. "Mike's tent is empty," David reported after a few seconds of investigation. "His sleeping bag's here, but he's not in it. And guys, there are tracks around his tent. Big ones." Sarah's blood turned to ice. She forced herself to unzip her tent and step outside, Jessica right behind her. David's flashlight revealed disturbed ground around Mike's tent, scuff marks in the dirt that looked like something had been dragged. "Maybe he just went to use the bathroom," Jessica suggested, but her voice lacked conviction. David shook his head, studying the tracks more carefully. "These prints, they don't look human. They're too wide, and look at the depth. Whatever made these was heavy, really heavy." The tracks led away from Mike's tent toward the tree line on the far side of the meadow. In the beam of David's flashlight, they could see where branches had been broken and undergrowth trampled, as if something large had crashed through the forest. "Mike," Sarah called out, her voice echoing across the lake. "Mike, where are you?" Her shout was answered by a sound that made all three of them step closer together. From somewhere deep in the forest came a call that might have been human, a voice shouting, "Help!" But there was something wrong with it. The voice was too deep, too resonant, and it seemed to come from multiple directions at once. "That's not Mike," David said quietly. "That's not human." The call came again, closer this time. "Help me! Please help me!" But now they could hear the wrongness more clearly. The words were slightly slurred, as if whatever was making the sound wasn't used to forming human speech. Jessica grabbed Sarah's arm. "We need to get out of here. Right now." But as they turned back toward their tents to grab their essential gear, they realized they were no longer alone in the meadow. Dark shapes were emerging from the tree line all around them, tall, hulking figures that moved with an unnatural gait. In the weak light of David's flashlight, they caught glimpses of matted fur, eyes that reflected the light like an animal's, and limbs that were too long for any human body. "The tent," David whispered urgently. "Get back to the tents. Stay together." But it was too late. The creatures, because that's what they were, Sarah realized with growing horror, not animals but not human either, had surrounded their campsite. She counted at least 6 of them, maybe more lurking in the shadows beyond their vision. One of the creatures stepped into the dying firelight, and Sarah had to bite back a scream. It stood nearly 8 feet tall, covered in dark, matted hair. Its face was almost human but stretched and distorted, with a jaw that protruded too far and teeth that were sharp and yellowed. Its arms hung down past its knees, ending in hands that were tipped with claws instead of fingernails. The thing tilted its head and studied them with an intelligence that was somehow worse than mindless animal hunger would have been. When it spoke, its voice was the same one that had been calling for help. But now they could see the mouth-forming words it had learned by listening to its victims. "Help me," it said again. But this time there was something like amusement in its tone. "Please help me." Then it smiled, revealing rows of teeth that no human mouth should contain. David slowly reached for his backpack, where he'd stored a flare gun for emergencies. But before he could grab it, the creature that had been speaking let out a sound that was part howl, part scream, and part something else entirely. The other shapes in the darkness responded with similar calls, and suddenly, the night was filled with inhuman voices that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Run!" David shouted, abandoning stealth. "Forget the gear. Just run!" They bolted toward the trail they'd hiked in on, David's flashlight beam dancing wildly as they crashed through the underbrush. Behind them, they could hear the creatures pursuing, not just following, but hunting. The sounds they made were coordinated, intelligent, as if they were herding their prey exactly where they wanted them to go. Sarah's lungs burned as they ran through the forest. Branches tore at her clothes and face, and she stumbled repeatedly on the uneven ground. But the terror gave her strength she didn't know she possessed. All she could think about was Mike. Where was he? What had happened to him? As if reading her thoughts, Mike's voice suddenly called out from somewhere ahead of them in the darkness. "Sarah, Jessica, I'm over here, help me!" They stopped running, gasping for breath. David grabbed Sarah's arm before she could run toward the voice. "That's not Mike," he said firmly. "Listen to it carefully." Now that they were standing still, Sarah could hear what David meant. The voice was Mike's, but it was too perfect somehow, like a recording being played back. And there was an echo to it that suggested it was coming from something much larger than Mike's slight frame. "Help me," the Mike voice called again. "I'm hurt, please." The real Mike would never sound so calm if he was actually injured and alone in these woods, Sarah realized. This was the same trick the creatures had tried before, mimicking human voices to lure them closer. "We have to keep moving," David whispered. "Get back to the truck. Get to town and get help." But as they tried to continue down the trail, they realized they were completely lost. In their panic, they'd run into the deep forest, far from any marked trail. David's flashlight revealed nothing but endless trees in every direction, and the beam was already getting dimmer as the batteries weakened. Worse, the creature calls were getting closer. They seemed to be coming from all around now, as if the things were closing in from every side. The voices had multiplied too, not just the fake Mike voice, but now they could hear what sounded like their own voices calling back and forth in the darkness. "Sarah, where are you?" came Jessica's voice from their left. "I'm right here," the real Jessica whispered, gripping Sarah's hand tighter. "We're over here," called David's voice from behind them. "That's not me," the real David said, his face pale in the flashlight beam. They were surrounded by their own voices, echoing back at them from creatures that had learned to mimic human speech by listening to their victims. Sarah felt her sanity beginning to crack as she heard herself calling out from multiple directions in the forest. "This way," she heard herself say from somewhere to their right. "I found the trail." "Don't listen," the real Sarah whispered to her friends. "We stick together. No matter what we hear, we don't separate." But the voices were getting more sophisticated, more convincing. Now they could hear full conversations, the creatures talking to each other in perfect imitations of human speech, discussing rescue plans and escape routes. It was psychological warfare designed to confuse and terrorize them. David's flashlight finally died, plunging them into complete darkness. In the sudden blackness, the creature calls grew louder and more excited, as if they knew their prey was now truly helpless. That's when Sarah heard the sound that made her heart stop completely. The low rumble of their own SUV's engine, coming from somewhere deeper in the forest. "How is that possible?" Jessica whispered. "The truck is miles away at the trailhead." But Sarah was beginning to understand the horrible truth. These creatures weren't just mimicking voices. They had been watching them, studying them, learning everything about them. They knew about the truck, knew about their planned escape route. They had been planning this hunt from the moment Sarah and her friends had arrived in their territory. As the engine sound grew closer, accompanied by the beam of headlights cutting through the trees, Sarah realized that whatever was driving their vehicle toward them in the darkness was not human. The hunt was just beginning. The headlights swept through the forest like searching eyes, accompanied by the familiar rumble of Sarah's SUV engine. But the sound was wrong. The engine was revving too high, grinding and sputtering as if someone who didn't understand machinery was operating it. "That's impossible," David whispered, pulling Sarah and Jessica deeper into the shadows between two massive pine trees. "The keys are in my backpack back at camp." As the vehicle drew closer, they could see it wasn't following any road or trail. It was crashing straight through the forest, mowing down saplings and scraping against larger trees with a horrible screech of metal against bark. Branches scraped across the windshield and sides with sounds like fingernails on a chalkboard. The headlights suddenly stopped moving, pointing directly at their hiding spot. The engine idled roughly for a moment, then shut off with a final violent cough. In the sudden silence that followed, they could hear the driver's door opening with its familiar squeak. Heavy footsteps crunched through the underbrush toward them. But the gait was all wrong. The steps were too far apart, as if whatever was walking had legs much longer than any humans. Between each footfall was a dragging sound, like something being pulled across the forest floor. "Sarah," came Mike's voice from the direction of the vehicle, but now it sounded strained and hollow. "Sarah, I got the truck. We can go home now." "Everything's okay." Jessica's grip on Sarah's arm tightened painfully. They could see a massive silhouette moving between the trees, illuminated by the SUV's headlights from behind. The shape was vaguely human but stretched upward, as if someone had grabbed a person by the head and feet and pulled until everything distorted. "I found the way out," the mic voice continued, and now they could hear wet, clicking sounds between the words, as if the creature's mouth wasn't designed for human speech. "Come to the truck. We need to leave before they find us." David slowly reached into his jacket pocket, feeling for the emergency whistle he always carried while hiking. It was a piercing blast that could be heard for miles. Maybe it would scare these things away, or at least confuse them long enough for his group to escape. But before he could bring the whistle to his lips, something grabbed his wrist from behind. Long, cold fingers wrapped around his arm with crushing strength, and he found himself staring into a face that was almost human, but wrong in every detail. The eyes were too large and too far apart. The nose was little more than 2 slits above a mouth that stretched too wide across the creature's face. "David found us," the thing said in a perfect imitation of Jessica's voice, even though Jessica was standing right beside him. David found the way home. More shapes emerged from the darkness around them. Sarah counted at least 8 of the creatures now, maybe more lurking beyond the reach of the headlights. They moved with coordinated intelligence, spreading out to cut off every possible escape route. One of them was dragging something behind it, a torn piece of fabric that looked like it might have been part of Mike's sleeping bag. Dark stains covered the material, and Sarah forced herself not to think about what they might be. "What do you want?" she called out, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. The creature holding David tilted its head, studying her with those 2 large eyes. When it spoke, it used her own voice, creating the surreal experience of hearing herself talk. "Want?" it said, sounding genuinely puzzled by the concept. "Want to play? Want to hunt? Want to learn?" Another creature stepped forward, this one holding something in its elongated hands. Sarah's blood turned to ice as she realized it was Mike's cell phone. The screen cracked, but still glowing faintly. "Mike taught us," the creature said, using Mike's voice, but with that same wet, clicking undertone. "Taught us words. Taught us sounds. Taught us about the truck." The horrible implication hit Sarah like a physical blow. Mike hadn't just disappeared. He'd been taken alive. These things had been using him to learn, to study their behavior and habits. They'd kept him conscious long enough to extract information about their group, their plans, their equipment. "Where is he?" Jessica demanded, tears streaming down her face. "What did you do to Mike?" The creature with the phone made a sound that might have been laughter. "Mike is here. Mike is everywhere. Mike is part of the game now." It held up the phone, and they could see the screen displaying a video, night vision footage of their campsite from earlier that evening. The timestamp showed it had been recorded around midnight, well before they'd noticed anything wrong. In the grainy green image, they could see themselves sleeping peacefully in their tents, completely unaware that they were being watched. But that wasn't the worst part. Moving at the edges of the frame were dark shapes, circling their campsite like wolves studying prey. The creatures had been observing them for hours before making their move, learning their routines, their voices, their relationships with each other. "You've been planning this," David said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This isn't random. You've been hunting people." The creature holding him made that laughing sound again. "Not hunting, playing. Humans make the best games. So smart, so creative, so educational." The casual way it said the word educational made Sarah's skin crawl. These weren't mindless beasts driven by hunger or territory. They were intelligent predators who hunted humans not for food, but for entertainment and knowledge. "The others who come to the mountains," Sarah said, pieces of a horrible puzzle falling into place in her mind. "The missing hikers. The people who never made it back to their cars. Good games," the creature confirmed, now using David's voice to respond. "Some taught us much, some taught us little. You are teaching us very much. Very good games." The creature dragging Mike's torn sleeping bag dropped it at Sarah's feet. Among the fabric, she could see other items. A hiking boot that was too small to be Mike's, a woman's jacket, a child's backpack. Personal effects from other victims, other games these things had played. "How long have you been doing this?" she asked, though part of her didn't want to know the answer. "Long time," came the reply in a voice that sounded like her own father. A voice she hadn't heard in years, since he died in a climbing accident in these same mountains. "Very long time. Mountains are good for games. Mountains are quiet. No one hears the games." The psychological impact of hearing her dead father's voice coming from one of these creatures was almost more than Sarah could bear. They weren't just mimicking recent victims. They had somehow absorbed and retained voices from years of hunting in these mountains. "Please," Jessica sobbed. "Please just let us go." "We won't tell anyone. We'll never come back." The creatures exchanged looks, and Sarah could see intelligence in their expressions, as if they were actually considering the request. But then the one holding David shook its head with mock sadness. "Game's not finished," it said in Mike's voice. "Game's just beginning. Still much to learn from you." That's when Sarah noticed something that gave her the first spark of hope she'd felt since this nightmare began. The creature holding David had released his wrist when it started talking, apparently confident that its companions had them completely surrounded. David was slowly, carefully reaching for something in his jacket pocket, the emergency flare. Sarah had forgotten about it, but David was right. He'd packed emergency flares in case they got lost or needed to signal for help. If he could set one off, the bright light might blind these things long enough for them to escape. Sarah tried to keep the creature's attention focused on her while David worked. "You said you learned from Mike. What exactly did he teach you?" "Taught us about phones," the creature said, holding up Mike's cracked device. "Taught us about truck. Taught us about friends coming to look when someone disappears." The implication was chilling. These creatures weren't just hunting random hikers. They were learning human behavior patterns, understanding how people would react to disappearances, potentially using that knowledge to lure in rescue teams and expand their hunting grounds. "Mike told us about Sarah," another creature added, using Jessica's voice. "Told us Sarah would never leave friends behind. Would come back to look. Would bring more friends to play games with." David's hand finally found what he was looking for. Sarah saw him grip the flare tightly, but before he could activate it, something crashed through the trees behind them. More creatures were approaching, and these ones were dragging something heavy. As they came into the light, Sarah saw what they had brought: a makeshift stretcher made from branches and torn fabric. Strapped to it was a figure in shredded camping clothes, but the body was wrong, twisted and elongated like the creatures themselves. Mike wanted to stay and play more games, one of the new arrivals said in a voice Sarah didn't recognize. Probably another victim from years past. Mike liked the games very much. The thing on the stretcher turned its head toward them, and Sarah saw with horror that it was indeed Mike, or what Mike was becoming. His face was still recognizably human, but his limbs had been stretched and distorted. His fingers ended in claws, and his eyes reflected the light like an animal's. When Mike spoke, his voice was the same as always, but the words came out wrong, stilted and strange. "Sarah, don't try to run. The games are fun once you stop fighting them. They'll teach you so many new things." Jessica screamed, a sound of pure terror and heartbreak that echoed across the mountain wilderness. The sound seemed to excite the creatures, and they began making their own vocalizations in response. Howls and calls that used human voices, but expressed emotions no human throat should be able to produce. "Your turn now," the creature holding David said, and its grip tightened on his arm with crushing force. "Your turn to learn new games." That's when David triggered the emergency flare. The brilliant red light exploded through the forest like a miniature sun, casting everything in stark, hellish illumination. The creatures shrieked and stumbled backward, covering their oversized eyes with their elongated hands. For a moment, Sarah could see them clearly, at least a dozen of them, all variations on the same theme of human features stretched and distorted into something nightmarish. "Run," David shouted, breaking free from the creature's momentarily loosened grip. "The truck! Get to the truck!" They sprinted toward Sarah's SUV, still sitting among the trees with its headlights cutting through the darkness. But as they reached it, Sarah realized why the engine had sounded wrong earlier. The interior was destroyed, seats torn to shreds, dashboard smashed, and worst of all, the engine compartment was filled with branches, rocks, and what looked like animal bones. The truck wasn't going anywhere. "The engine's completely trashed," David said, slamming the SUV's hood shut after a quick inspection. "They've stuffed the air intake full of debris. Even if we could get it started, we'd never make it a mile." The flare was already beginning to fade, and they could hear the creatures recovering from the initial shock of the bright light. Angry vocalizations echoed through the forest as the things called to each other in their stolen human voices. "The radio," Jessica said desperately, diving into the destroyed cab of the truck. "Emergency services monitor channel 16. Maybe we can call for help." But the CB radio had been smashed beyond repair, along with everything else in the vehicle's interior. The creatures had been thorough in their sabotage, ensuring their prey had no means of escape or communication. "Sarah, over here," came Mike's voice from the darkness beyond the headlights. But now they could hear multiple Mike voices calling from different directions, as if the creatures had learned to coordinate their mimicry. "We need to move," David said, grabbing what supplies he could from the wreckage of their gear. "They're regrouping. That flare only bought us a few minutes." Sarah stuffed her pockets with energy bars and a small water bottle that had survived the destruction. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely function, but somehow her mind was working with crystal clarity. Years of corporate problem-solving had taught her to think logically, even under pressure. "The trailhead," she said. "If we can make it back to the main road, there might be other campers. Or at least we'll be closer to civilization." "That's 4 miles through forest we don't know," David replied. "And they know these mountains better than we do." "Then what's your plan?" Jessica snapped, fear making her voice sharp. "Stay here and let them turn us into whatever they did to Mike?" The sound of approaching footsteps cut off their debate. Heavy, dragging steps were coming toward them from multiple directions, and they could see shapes moving just beyond the reach of the headlights. "This way," David whispered, pointing toward what looked like a game trail leading downhill. "If we can get to lower elevation, maybe we'll hit a creek or river. Water might mask our scent." They moved as quietly as possible, but every footstep seemed impossibly loud in the mountain stillness. Behind them, they could hear the creatures systematically searching the area around the truck, calling to each other in voices that belonged to their victims. "Sarah's not in the truck," came her own voice from behind them. "Check the forest," replied what sounded like David. They went toward the creek, added Mike's voice, and Sarah's heart sank as she realized the creatures were tracking them successfully. The game trail led them down a steep slope covered in loose rocks and fallen logs. In the darkness, it was treacherous going. They had to feel their way carefully to avoid making noise that would give away their position. More than once, one of them nearly fell and had to be steadied by the others. After what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, they heard the sound of running water ahead. A small creek cut through the forest, its banks lined with thick underbrush that might provide cover. "We can follow this downstream," David whispered. "Water runs toward civilization eventually." But as they approached the creek, Sarah noticed something that made her blood run cold. Scattered along the banks were more personal items: boots, pieces of clothing, camping equipment. Some of it looked recent, but other items were weathered and old, as if they'd been there for years. "This is where they bring people," she realized. "This creek, it's like a highway for them. They use it to move victims around the mountain." Jessica picked up a child's stuffed animal that was lying among the debris, its fur matted with age and weather. "How long have they been doing this? How many people have died up here?" Before anyone could answer, they heard splashing from upstream. Something large was moving through the water, coming toward them. In the faint starlight, they could see a dark shape wading down the creek, moving with purpose rather than the random wandering of a wild animal. "They're hurting us," David said with sudden understanding. "That's what this is. They drove us away from the truck, down this specific trail, to this specific place. We're not escaping. We're being led exactly where they want us to go." The realization hit Sarah like a physical blow. These creatures weren't just intelligent, they were strategic. They'd probably been planning this hunt from the moment her group had arrived at the trailhead. Maybe even before that, if they'd been watching the parking area and selecting victims. "The whole thing was a setup," she whispered. "They probably sabotaged our truck hours ago while we were sleeping. Made sure we'd have to try to escape on foot." More splashing sounds came from downstream now, and shapes were moving through the forest on both sides of the creek. They were completely surrounded, trapped in a carefully orchestrated kill zone. "Up the bank," David said urgently. "High ground. Make them come at us uphill." They scrambled up the steep creek bank, grabbing onto roots and rocks to pull themselves higher. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew louder and more coordinated. The creatures weren't trying to hide their approach anymore. They knew their prey was trapped. At the top of the bank, they found themselves on a small rocky outcropping that gave them a view of the forest below. In the faint moonlight, they could see dark shapes moving through the trees. At least a dozen of them converging on their position. "David," came Jessica's voice from the forest below. "Why don't you come down? We found a way out." "That's not me," the real Jessica said, pressing close to Sarah on the narrow ledge. "Sarah, I can see the road from here," called out David's voice. "Just follow my voice. Everything's going to be okay." But the real David was right beside them, and his face was pale with terror as he heard his own voice being used against them. The psychological warfare was wearing them down, Sarah realized. Even knowing the voices were fake, hearing their friends calling to them from the darkness was almost impossible to resist. Part of her brain kept insisting that maybe, somehow, the voices were real. Maybe Mike really had escaped and was trying to help them. "We need to find a weapon," David said, scanning their surroundings. "Rocks, branches, anything." Sarah picked up a chunk of granite about the size of a softball, while Jessica found a fallen tree branch that was heavy enough to use as a club. David had his multi-tool, which included a knife blade, though it seemed pathetically small against creatures that stood 8 feet tall. "If we're going to die up here," Sarah said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice, "we're going to make it cost them something." The first creature appeared at the base of their rocky perch, and in the moonlight, they could see it clearly for the first time. It was even more horrible than the glimpses they'd caught in the firelight back at camp. Its body was human in basic structure, but wrong in every proportion. Too tall, too thin, with limbs that bent in places where joints shouldn't exist. But the worst part was its face. It was recognizably Mike, but as if someone had taken his features and stretched them like putty. The eyes were in the right place, but too large. The mouth was Mike's mouth, but filled with too many teeth. When it smiled up at them, Sarah had to fight the urge to vomit. "Hello, Sarah," it said in Mike's voice. "Why don't you come down? I want to show you something amazing." Other creatures emerged from the forest, surrounding the base of their rocky outcrop. Sarah counted 13 of them, but there might have been more hidden in the shadows. Some of them wore faces she didn't recognize, other victims from other hunts over the years. One of them looked like a young woman, maybe a college student, with features that had been stretched and distorted in the same way as Mike's. When she spoke, her voice was sweet and pleading. "Please help me. I've been lost for so long. I just want to go home." Another had the face of a middle-aged man, possibly a solo hiker who'd vanished years ago. "I know the way out," he said in a voice rough with decades of mountain weather. "I can take you to safety. You just have to trust me." But Sarah could see the intelligence behind their eyes, the predatory patience of creatures who had perfected their hunting techniques over years, or maybe decades. These weren't the original victims begging for help. These were the things that had consumed them, wearing their faces like masks while using their voices to lure in new prey. "How many people have you killed?" she called down to them. The creature with Mike's face tilted its head, considering the question. "Killed is wrong word. Taught, changed, made part of the mountain. Made part of the game. The missing hikers," Jessica said, pieces falling into place. "All those people who disappeared in the Beartooth Mountains over the years. It wasn't accidents or getting lost. It was you. Good games," the creature confirmed. "Some were very good games. Taught us much about human nature, about fear, about hope, about friendship." It gestured to the other creatures surrounding their position. "Each one taught us something new. This one taught us about motherhood," it said, pointing to what had once been a woman. "This one taught us about determination," indicating another distorted figure. "Mike taught us about loyalty, about sacrifice, about how far friends will go to save each other." The implication was clear and horrible. These creatures didn't just kill their victims, they transformed them somehow, turned them into more of themselves while preserving enough of the original personality to make them effective hunting tools. "What do you want from us?" David asked. "Want to learn about planning?" the creature said, using Mike's voice but with growing excitement. "Want to learn about corporate thinking? About problem-solving under pressure? Sarah has much to teach us about these things." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. These creatures had been studying them, learning about their backgrounds, their personalities, their skills. They weren't random victims. They'd been specifically selected for what they could contribute to the creature's knowledge. "And Jessica will teach us about healing," another creature added. "About medical knowledge, about keeping games alive longer. David knows mountains, knows survival, knows how humans navigate wilderness. Very valuable knowledge." They weren't just hunting for sport or food. They were hunting for information, for skills and knowledge they could add to their collective intelligence. Each victim made them smarter, more dangerous, better adapted to hunting future prey. The creature with Mike's face began climbing toward their rocky perch, its elongated limbs allowing it to navigate the steep stone face with disturbing ease. Others followed, approaching from multiple angles to cut off any possible escape route. "This is it," David said quietly, gripping his knife. "Whatever happens, we stick together. We don't let them separate us." But even as he spoke, Sarah could see more creatures emerging from the forest below. They'd been patient, methodical, building up overwhelming force before making their final move. Whatever these things were, wherever they'd come from, they'd turned the Montana wilderness into their personal hunting ground, and Sarah and her friends were about to become their newest teachers. The first creature reached the top of their rocky outcrop, pulling itself up with strength that was clearly inhuman. As it straightened to its full height, towering over them in the moonlight, it spoke one final time in Mike's familiar voice. "Class is now in session." Marcus Chen had been planning this photography trip to Glacier National Park for over 2 years. As a freelance nature photographer from Seattle, he'd built his reputation capturing the raw beauty of the Pacific Northwest. But Montana's wilderness represented his ultimate challenge, the kind of pristine, untouched landscape that could make or break a career. "This is it," he told his girlfriend Emma as they loaded camera equipment into his modified Toyota 4Runner. "The portfolio that's going to get me that National Geographic contract." Emma Rodriguez, a park ranger from Olympic National Park, had taken vacation time to join him. Her expertise in wilderness safety and her knowledge of animal behavior made her the perfect companion for what Marcus planned to be an intensive 2-week expedition into some of the most remote areas of Glacier. "Just promise me you'll listen when I tell you something's dangerous," Emma said, double-checking their emergency supplies. "I've seen too many photographers get so focused on the perfect shot that they forget they're in grizzly country." Marcus laughed, hefting his expensive telephoto lens. "That's what I have you for, to keep me from becoming bear food while I'm getting the shots that are going to make us famous." Their plan was ambitious but carefully researched. They would spend the first week in the more accessible areas of the park, then venture into the backcountry for a series of shots that Marcus was convinced would be groundbreaking. He'd identified several locations that had rarely been photographed, remote valleys and hidden lakes that required multi-day hikes to reach. The drive from Seattle to Glacier took them through some of the most beautiful country in America, but Marcus barely noticed the scenery. His mind was already focused on the shots he planned to capture: golden hour lighting on the Continental Divide, wildlife in their natural habitat, the kind of pristine wilderness photography that was becoming increasingly rare as development encroached on wild spaces. "You're doing that thing again," Emma said as they crossed into Montana. "What thing?" "That thing where you're so focused on what you're going to photograph that you forget to actually see what's right in front of you." Marcus glanced out the window and was struck by the dramatic landscape rolling past: endless forests, snow-capped peaks, and valleys that seemed to stretch to infinity. "Point taken. But this trip is going to change everything for us. The magazine contracts, the exhibition opportunities, maybe even a book deal." Emma smiled, but her expression was tinged with concern. "Just don't lose sight of why we're really here. Sometimes the best experiences can't be captured in a photograph." They reached the park in late afternoon, checking into their reserved campsite at Apgar. The next morning, Marcus was up before dawn, setting up his equipment to capture the sunrise over Lake McDonald. The shots were spectacular, mirror-perfect reflections of the mountains, mist rising from the water, the kind of magical lighting that photographers dream about. "This is just the warm-up," he told Emma as they reviewed the images on his camera's LCD screen. "Wait until we get into the real wilderness areas." For the first week, everything went according to plan. They hiked the popular trails during the day, with Marcus capturing stunning images of wildlife, landscapes, and the dramatic interplay of light and shadow that made Glacier National Park famous. His telephoto lens allowed him to photograph mountain goats on seemingly impossible cliff faces, while his wide-angle shots captured the vast scale of the wilderness. Emma proved invaluable as both a safety guide and a spotter. Her trained eye could identify potential hazards and wildlife behavior patterns that helped Marcus get closer to his subjects safely. More importantly, her presence allowed him to take risks he never would have attempted alone. "Look at this," Marcus said, showing her a shot of a grizzly bear fishing in a stream. The light, the composition, the behavior. This is exactly the kind of authentic wildlife photography that magazines are desperate for. But it was on their 8th day that Marcus made the discovery that would change everything. They were scouting locations for their backcountry expedition when they stumbled across an unmarked trail leading deeper into the wilderness than any of their maps indicated. "This doesn't appear on any of the official park maps," Emma said, studying their topographic charts. "Could be an old game trail, or maybe something left over from before the area became a national park." Marcus was already unpacking his camera equipment. "Whatever it is, it leads to areas that probably haven't been photographed in decades. Maybe ever. This could be the discovery that makes my career." The trail was barely visible, more of a suggestion than an actual path, but it led through some of the most pristine wilderness either of them had ever seen. Ancient trees that had never felt a saw, meadows where wildflowers grew in impossible profusion, streams so clear they seemed like liquid crystal. "It's like we've stepped back in time," Emma whispered as they followed the faint trail deeper into the mountains. "This is what the whole continent must have looked like before European settlement." Marcus was shooting constantly, burning through memory cards as he captured image after image of untouched wilderness. The light was perfect. The compositions were once-in-a-lifetime opportunities, and the sense of discovery was intoxicating. That's when they heard the voices. At first they thought it was other hikers. Distant conversations carried on the mountain air, too far away to make out individual words, but clearly human in origin. But something about the voices seemed odd. They were coming from multiple directions, as if several groups of people were spread throughout the wilderness around them. "I didn't think anyone else knew about this area," Emma said, scanning the forest with her binoculars. "Maybe we're not as far off the beaten path as we thought," Marcus replied, though he was disappointed at the thought of sharing his discovery with other photographers. But as they continued following the trail, the voices became more distinct, and what they heard made both of them stop in their tracks. "Marcus, over here," came a voice that sounded exactly like Emma's, calling from somewhere to their left. "I found the perfect spot," called another voice, this one sounding like Marcus himself, coming from their right. Emma grabbed Marcus's arm. "That's not me calling you. I'm right here." "And that's not me either," Marcus said, his excitement about the photography expedition suddenly replaced by a cold knot of fear in his stomach. The voices continued, now clearly mimicking their own speech patterns and mannerisms. They could hear themselves having conversations they'd never had, discussing plans they'd never made, calling to each other from multiple locations in the surrounding forest. "We need to go back," Emma said, her ranger training kicking in. "This isn't natural. Something's very wrong here." But Marcus was already raising his camera, his photographer's instincts overriding his common sense. "Wait, I need to document this." "Whatever's happening here, it could be the story of a lifetime." "Marcus, no," Emma said sharply. "We leave. Now." That's when they heard the third voice, one that made Emma's blood run cold. It was her supervisor from Olympic National Park, Ranger Peterson, calling out in his familiar gruff tone. "Rodriguez, where's your position report? You were supposed to check in an hour ago." "That's impossible," Emma whispered. "Peterson is 800 miles away in Washington." "He doesn't even know we're here." The voice came again, closer now and with growing irritation. "Rodriguez, I need that report now, or you're looking at a formal reprimand." Marcus lowered his camera, finally grasping the seriousness of their situation. "How is it possible for something to know your supervisor's voice? To know his speech patterns well enough to imitate him perfectly?" Before Emma could answer, they heard a sound that made both of them freeze in terror. It was Emma's own voice, calling out from somewhere behind them on the trail they'd just traveled. "Marcus! Marcus, help me! Something's got me." The voice was perfect. Emma's exact intonation, her speech patterns, even the slight breathiness that came when she was frightened or excited. But Emma was standing right beside Marcus, and the voice was coming from at least 100 yards away. "That's not possible," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Marcus, please," came Emma's voice again, now with desperate sobbing. "It hurts. Please help me." Every instinct in Marcus's body screamed at him to run toward the voice, to help Emma, even though he could see her standing right beside him. The emotional manipulation was almost overwhelming. Hearing someone you love crying for help triggers responses that bypass rational thought. Emma grabbed his arm before he could move. "Don't listen to it. Whatever's making those sounds, it's not me. We need to get out of here right now." But as they turned to head back down the trail, they discovered that the path behind them had changed. Where there had been a clear trail leading back toward the main park area, now there were only dense forest and impenetrable underbrush. "This isn't right," Emma said, consulting her compass and GPS unit. "The trail was right here 20 minutes ago." Marcus was checking his camera's GPS logging feature, which recorded the exact location of every photograph. According to the data, they were still following the same path they'd been on all morning. But the physical evidence of their eyes told a different story. "The GPS says we haven't deviated from our original route," he told Emma. "But obviously something's changed." The voices were multiplying now. They could hear their own conversations being repeated back to them from multiple directions. Discussions they'd had earlier that morning, plans they'd made for the next day, even private conversations from their relationship that no one else could possibly have overheard. "Marcus, I love you," came Emma's voice from the forest to their left, repeating something she'd said to him the night before in their tent. "Em, this trip means everything to me," came Marcus's voice from their right, echoing words he'd spoken during dinner, but underneath the familiar words, both of them could detect something wrong. A slight distortion, as if the voices were being played back through speakers that weren't quite calibrated correctly. "We're being watched," Emma said quietly. "Studied. Something's been listening to us, learning our voices, our mannerisms." Marcus raised his camera again, but this time not to take pictures. The camera's telephoto lens made an excellent spotting scope, and through it, he could scan the forest around them for any sign of what might be creating the voices. "There," he said, pointing toward a stand of pine trees about 50 yards away. "Movement. Something big." Emma followed his gaze and saw what looked like a human figure standing among the trees. But the proportions were wrong. Too tall, too thin, with limbs that seemed to bend in ways that human joints couldn't accommodate. "That's not human," she said, her voice tight with controlled fear. Through the telephoto lens, Marcus could see more details that made his skin crawl. The figure had a vaguely human shape, but its features were stretched and distorted, as if someone had taken a person and pulled them like taffy. Its arms hung down past its knees, and its head was tilted at an angle that would have broken a human neck. "There are more of them," Emma whispered, pointing to other shapes moving through the forest around them. "We're surrounded." That's when Marcus made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life, however long that might be. Instead of running, instead of focusing on escape, he raised his camera and began taking pictures. The telephoto lens captured details that were invisible to the naked eye. The creatures, because that's what they clearly were, moved with coordinated intelligence, positioning themselves to cut off every possible escape route. Their faces were horrifying parodies of human features, stretched and twisted but still recognizably humanoid. "Marcus, what are you doing?" Emma hissed. "We need to run." "I'm documenting this," he replied, his photographer's instincts overriding his survival instincts. "The world needs to know these things exist." Through his viewfinder, he watched as one of the creatures stepped into a patch of sunlight, revealing features that made him gasp. It was human, or had been human once. The face was familiar, though distorted beyond easy recognition. After a moment, Marcus realized he was looking at missing hiker Thomas Bradley. whose disappearance had made headlines 2 years earlier. "Emma," he said, his voice shaking. "I think I know what happened to all the missing hikers." Emma looked through Marcus's camera viewfinder and immediately wished she hadn't. The creature, standing in the sunlight, had been human once. She could see that now. But whatever had happened to transform Thomas Bradley into this thing had stretched and distorted his body in ways that defied biological possibility. His missing person report said he was 5'8" and 160 pounds. She whispered, "That thing has to be at least 7 feet tall." Marcus continued photographing, his professional training taking over even in the face of terror. The images he was capturing would have been career-making under any other circumstances. Clear, detailed photographs of creatures that shouldn't exist, in habitat that most people would never see. "Marcus, I love the way you see the world through that camera," came Emma's voice from the forest, repeating something she'd said to him months ago during a romantic dinner in Seattle. But the voice was coming from the creature that had once been Thomas Bradley, and hearing her intimate words spoken by that twisted mouth made her feel physically sick. "The way you capture light is like poetry," the creature continued, perfectly mimicking Emma's speech patterns and emotional inflections. "You make me see beauty I never noticed before." The psychological impact was devastating. Hearing her own voice, her own words, speaking her private feelings for Marcus through the mouth of that abomination was almost worse than any physical threat could have been. More creatures emerged from the forest, and Marcus realized with growing horror that he recognized several of them from missing person reports he'd seen in park literature. Sarah Chen, the botanist who'd vanished while collecting specimens 3 years ago. Michael Torres, the solo backpacker who'd disappeared the previous summer. Rachel Kim, the wildlife photographer who'd been searching for the perfect grizzly shot when she'd never returned to her car. "They're all here," Emma said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Everyone who's disappeared in this area over the past few years. They've all been changed." The creature that had been Rachel Kim stepped forward, and when it spoke, it used Marcus's own voice. "The light is perfect right now. Golden hour magic. This is the shot that's going to make my career." Hearing his own words, his own dreams and ambitions, coming from that distorted mouth made Marcus finally lower his camera. The professional distance that photography provided suddenly evaporated, and he was left face to face with the reality of their situation. "What do you want from us?" Emma called out, falling back on her ranger training for dealing with dangerous wildlife. The creature that had been Thomas Bradley tilted its elongated head, considering the question. When it spoke, it used Emma's voice. "Want to learn, want to grow, want to understand how humans see the world. We learn from each person who comes to the mountains," added the Sarah Chen creature, using Marcus's voice. "Each person teaches us something new about human nature, human knowledge, human dreams." Marcus felt his skin crawl as he realized the implications. These things weren't just killing hikers, they were absorbing them somehow, taking their memories, their voices, their personalities, and incorporating them into some kind of collective intelligence. "Rachel taught us about photography," the creature that had been Michael Torres said, using Rachel's voice. "About seeing beauty through a lens, about capturing moments that will last forever." "Thomas taught us about botany," added another creature, using Thomas's voice. "About how plants and animals interact, about the delicate balance of wilderness ecosystems." Each creature had retained the specialized knowledge of its original human form, but twisted and corrupted for purposes that made Emma's ranger instincts scream warnings. These weren't random animal attacks or even typical predator behavior. This was something far more sinister, a form of hunting that consumed not just the body but the mind and soul of the victim. "What about the others?" Marcus asked, though part of him didn't want to know the answer. "All the other missing hikers over the years? Good teachers," the creatures replied in unison, using a chorus of stolen voices. "Each one added to our understanding. Each one made us more complete." Emma's GPS unit suddenly began beeping with an incoming message. She looked at the screen and felt her heart stop. The message was from her supervisor at Olympic National Park. "Rodriguez, where's your position report? You missed your scheduled check-in, but that was impossible." She wasn't supposed to check in for another 3 days, and besides, they were in an area with no cell coverage. The GPS unit shouldn't be receiving any messages at all. How did they know to expect a check-in? Marcus asked, looking over her shoulder at the device. They didn't, Emma said, her voice tight with realization. I never scheduled a check-in. But I talked about my supervisor yesterday, remember? I mentioned his communication protocols when I was explaining park service procedures. The creatures had been listening to their conversations, learning not just their voices but their relationships, their professional obligations, their connections to the outside world. They were using that information to manipulate them psychologically, creating false urgency and confusion. Very good, Emma, said the creature that had been Rachel Kim, using Emma's supervisor's voice. You're learning to think like a predator. That knowledge will be very useful when we add it to our collection. The casual way the creature referred to adding them to its collection made Marcus's blood run cold. These things weren't just killing people. They were farming them for knowledge and experience. The photography equipment will be especially valuable, another creature added, using Marcus's voice to discuss his own gear. So many technical skills, so much artistic vision, so much passion for capturing the perfect image. Marcus realized that his expensive camera equipment, which he'd been so proud of and protective of, was being evaluated like livestock by intelligent predators. Everything he'd worked for, everything he'd dreamed of accomplishing, was just potential resources for these creatures to exploit. We need to run, Emma said quietly. Right now. But as they looked around for escape routes, they realized the creatures had been methodically cutting off every possible path. The forest seemed to close in around them, with dark shapes moving between the trees in coordinated patterns that spoke of intelligence and planning. The old trail, Marcus said, pointing toward what looked like a faint path leading up a steep ridge. It's the only direction they haven't blocked off. They ran toward the ridge, crashing through underbrush and scrambling over fallen logs. Behind them, they could hear the creatures pursuing, not with the random chaos of animal predators, but with the organized coordination of a hunting party that knew exactly what it was doing. Marcus, wait for me, called Emma's voice from behind them, but the real Emma was right beside Marcus, running for her life. Emma, this way, called Marcus's voice from ahead of them. But Marcus was running beside Emma, and he hadn't said anything. The creatures were using their stolen voices to create confusion, to make them doubt their own senses and potentially run in the wrong direction. It was psychological warfare of the most sophisticated kind. As they climbed the steep ridge, Marcus could hear his expensive camera equipment banging against rocks and trees in his backpack. Each impact made him wince, thousands of dollars of delicate electronics being damaged, but he forced himself to focus on escape rather than protecting his gear. There, Emma gasped, pointing toward what looked like a cave entrance near the top of the ridge. Shelter. We can defend a narrow opening. They scrambled toward the cave, but as they got closer, Marcus realized something that made his heart sink. The opening wasn't a natural cave, it was too regular, too deliberately shaped. And around the entrance, partially hidden by vegetation, were more personal items from missing hikers. Emma, this isn't shelter, he said, grabbing her arm before she could enter the cave. It's a trap. Look at all the gear around the entrance. This is where they bring people. Emma saw the hiking boots, water bottles, camping equipment, and personal items scattered around the cave mouth and immediately understood. It's a feeding site, or a processing site, somewhere they take victims to change them. The sound of approaching footsteps made them abandon the cave and continue climbing. But the ridge was getting steeper and more treacherous, and both of them were exhausted from the sustained sprint through difficult terrain. We can't keep this pace, Emma panted. We need to find somewhere to make a stand. Marcus looked back and saw the creatures climbing after them with inhuman agility. Their elongated limbs and distorted joints actually seemed to give them advantages on the steep terrain. They could reach handholds that would be impossible for normal humans and navigate obstacles with disturbing ease. The photography equipment, Marcus said suddenly. The flash units. If these things are adapted for forest hunting, bright light might disorient them. He quickly dug into his camera bag and pulled out his most powerful external flash unit, a professional strobe designed for wildlife photography. The unit was capable of producing incredibly intense bursts of light. bright enough to momentarily blind subjects even in daylight. "When I say now, close your eyes," he told Emma, positioning himself to face the approaching creatures. The first creature, the thing that had been Thomas Bradley, reached their position and stretched out an elongated arm toward Emma. Marcus triggered the flash unit at maximum power, and the burst of light was so intense it left after images even through his closed eyelids. The creature shrieked and stumbled backward, covering its oversized eyes with hands that ended in claws instead of fingernails. The other creatures following behind also recoiled from the sudden brilliance, giving Marcus and Emma a few precious seconds to continue their escape. "The light hurts them," Emma shouted as they ran. "They're adapted for hunting in forest shadows." Marcus triggered several more flash bursts as they climbed, each one buying them a little more time. But he could see the battery indicator on his flash unit dropping rapidly. Professional strobes consumed enormous amounts of power, and he only had a limited number of shots before the equipment would be useless. They reached the crest of the ridge and found themselves looking down into another valley, one that wasn't marked on any of their maps. The landscape below was dotted with structures that looked almost like a primitive village, but built on a scale too large for human habitation. "What is that place?" Emma asked, studying the strange buildings through Marcus's telephoto lens. Through the powerful lens, Marcus could see that the structures were made from materials he didn't recognize, not wood or stone, but something organic-looking that seemed to shift and flow even as he watched. And moving between the buildings were more of the creatures, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. "It's not a village," he realized with growing horror. "It's a colony, a breeding ground. This isn't just a few creatures hunting in the wilderness. It's an entire population." Emma's GPS unit beeped again with another message, this one appearing to be from Marcus himself. "Emma, I found a way out. Follow the ridge north to the old mining road. Help is coming!" But Marcus was standing right beside her, and he hadn't sent any message. "They're learning our technology too," Emma said, her voice filled with despair. "They're not just mimicking our voices, they're figuring out how to use our equipment to manipulate us." The sound of approaching footsteps made them abandon their observation of the strange valley and continue along the ridge. But Marcus was beginning to realize that their escape attempt might be exactly what the creatures wanted. They were being herded just like prey animals toward some predetermined destination. "Emma," he said as they ran, "what if running is exactly what they expect us to do? What if we're playing right into their hunting strategy?" Before she could answer, they heard a sound that made both of them stop in their tracks. It was the distinctive whine of helicopter rotors coming from somewhere ahead of them along the ridge. "Search and rescue," Emma breathed. "Someone must have noticed we didn't check in." They ran toward the sound, hope flooding through them for the first time since this nightmare had begun. But as they rounded a bend in the ridge, they saw something that made Marcus's heart sink once again. There was indeed a helicopter sitting on a flat area of the ridge. But the aircraft was clearly derelict, covered in vegetation, with parts of the fuselage corroded and damaged. It had been there for years, maybe decades, and standing beside it, wearing the uniform of a Park Service helicopter pilot, was another creature. This one had apparently once been human too, but it had been changed and stretched like all the others. When it spoke, it used the voice of a professional rescue pilot. "Folks, I'm here to get you out. Climb aboard and we'll have you back to civilization in no time." Marcus realized with absolute certainty that they were trapped in a hunting ground that had been perfected over years or decades of luring victims into the wilderness. Every escape route, every potential rescue, every hope of salvation had been anticipated and turned into another part of the trap. They were prey in a game designed by predators far more intelligent and patient than anything he'd ever imagined possible. And the game was just getting started. Marcus and Emma backed away from the derelict helicopter and its grotesque pilot, but they could hear more creatures approaching from behind. They were trapped on the narrow ridge with nowhere left to run. "This helicopter," Emma said, studying the aircraft more closely, "it's from the 1980s. Look at the registration numbers. This is the search and rescue chopper that disappeared during the Whitman family search in 1987. The creature wearing the pilot's uniform smiled with a mouth that stretched too wide across its distorted face. "Been waiting a long time for passengers." it said in a voice that perfectly mimicked a professional rescue pilot. "Don't worry, folks. This bird still flies like a dream." Marcus raised his camera and took several quick shots of the creature and the helicopter. Through his telephoto lens, he could see details that made his skin crawl. The aircraft's interior had been modified. Seats torn out and replaced with what looked like organic webbing. Controls that had grown over with something resembling fungal growth. "It's not just the people they change," he whispered to Emma. "They're adapting our technology too, making it part of whatever they are." The pilot creature gestured toward the helicopter's open door. "Climb aboard. Time to see the real wilderness. Time to understand what these mountains are really for." Behind them, the other creatures had reached the ridge and were closing in. The Thomas Bradley thing stepped forward, its elongated limbs moving with predatory grace. "No more running," it said in Emma's voice. "Time to join the community. Time to become part of something bigger than yourselves." Emma's ranger training kicked in as she assessed their tactical situation. They were outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and trapped on a narrow ridge with creatures approaching from both directions. But she noticed something that might give them a chance. "The helicopter," she whispered to Marcus. "The fuel tank, if we could rupture it somehow." Marcus understood immediately. Aviation fuel was highly combustible, and his camera equipment included several more powerful flash units. If they could create a spark near spilled fuel, the explosion might give them the distraction they needed to escape. "Can you get to the fuel cap?" Emma asked quietly. "If you can keep them talking," Marcus replied, slowly reaching for another flash unit in his camera bag. Emma stepped forward, addressing the pilot creature directly. "Before we go anywhere, I want to understand what happened to you. You were human once. What changed you?" The creature tilted its head, and for a moment something almost human flickered in its oversized eyes. "Crash landing," it said, and now its voice carried genuine emotion. "Storm came in fast, lost visibility, tried to find a place to set down, but the mountains wanted us." "The mountains wanted you?" Emma pressed, trying to buy Marcus time to position himself near the helicopter's fuel system. "Old things live in these mountains," the creature continued, its voice taking on a dreamy, distant quality. "Things that were here before humans, before animals, before the ice ages. They sleep deep in the earth, but they dream, and their dreams change things." Marcus carefully opened the helicopter's fuel cap while the creature was distracted by its own story. Aviation fuel began to leak out, creating a puddle on the rocky ridge. "We crashed in the valley below," the pilot thing went on. "Broke my back, broke my legs. Should have died. Would have died. But the dreams found us first. The dreams offered us a choice. Die as humans, or live as something more. And you chose to live," Emma said, genuinely moved despite her terror. Part of her could understand the desperate choice faced by dying people in the wilderness. "At first, yes," the creature replied. "But now I understand it wasn't really a choice. The dreams don't ask. They take, they change. They make you part of their hunger." The honesty in the creature's voice was more terrifying than any threat could have been. This thing had once been human, had made a desperate choice to survive, and had been transformed into something that hunted other humans. But somewhere inside, the original person was still there, trapped and aware of what they'd become. "The fuel," Marcus whispered to Emma. "It's ready." But before he could trigger his flash unit, the creature that had been Thomas Bradley suddenly lunged forward with inhuman speed. Its elongated arms wrapped around Emma, lifting her off her feet with crushing strength. "No more talking," it said in Marcus's voice. "Time to see the colony. Time to understand what you're going to become." Marcus triggered the flash unit directly at the spilled aviation fuel. The intense burst of light created a spark that ignited the fuel with a whoosh of flame. The explosion wasn't large enough to destroy the helicopter, but it created a wall of fire between them and several of the creatures. In the confusion, Emma managed to break free from the Thomas Bradley thing's grip. She and Marcus ran along the ridge away from the burning fuel, but they could hear the creatures pursuing despite the flames. "The valley!" Emma shouted over the sound of crackling fire. "We have to get down to that colony. It's the only place they might not expect us to go." "Are you crazy?" Marcus replied. But he was already following her down the steep slope, toward the strange settlement below. The descent was treacherous, loose rocks and steep grades that threatened to send them tumbling into the valley in an uncontrolled fall. But behind them, the creatures were navigating the terrain with disturbing ease, their modified bodies giving them advantages on the difficult ground. As they got closer to the colony, Marcus could see through his camera lens that the structures were even more bizarre than they'd appeared from the ridge. The buildings seemed to be grown rather than built, organic shapes that pulsed gently as if alive. Doorways opened and closed like breathing mouths. Windows blinked like eyes. What is this place? Emma gasped as they reached the edge of the settlement. It's not human, Marcus said, taking photographs even as they ran. It's not built by humans or for humans. We're looking at something that evolved here, something that's been adapting our world to its needs. Moving through the settlement were more creatures, dozens of them, all bearing the stretched and distorted features of former humans. But these ones were different from the hunters they'd encountered in the forest. These seemed more integrated into the organic architecture, as if they'd been changed not just physically, but merged with the living buildings themselves. The missing hikers from decades past, Emma realized. This is where they all ended up. Not just changed, but incorporated into some kind of collective organism. One of the buildings ahead of them dilated an opening like a giant iris, and from inside came a voice that made both of them stop in their tracks. It was Marcus's own voice, but speaking words he'd never said. "Welcome home, Marcus. We've been waiting for you. Your photography skills will help us document the transformation of this world." "That's not possible," Marcus whispered. "How can it know things I haven't even thought yet?" "Because it's not just taking your voice," Emma said with growing horror. "It's taking your thoughts, your memories, your dreams and plans for the future." From another building came Emma's voice. "Your ranger training will be invaluable, Emma. You understand wilderness ecosystems. You know how to guide people safely through dangerous terrain. Those skills will help us hunt more effectively." The psychological impact of hearing their own voices discuss their assimilation into this nightmare colony was overwhelming. These creatures weren't just planning to kill them. They were planning to turn them into tools for hunting other humans. "The dreams the pilot mentioned," Marcus said as they moved deeper into the settlement. "I think this whole colony is part of some larger organism, something that's been sleeping under the mountains and using dreams to change people who get too close." As if summoned by his words, the ground beneath their feet began to pulse with a rhythm like a massive heartbeat. The organic buildings around them responded to the pulse, their walls contracting and expanding in sync with the underground rhythm. "It's waking up," Emma said. "Our presence here is waking up whatever's been sleeping under the mountains." The pulse grew stronger, and with it came a sound like whispering, thousands of voices speaking in languages that predated human speech. But underneath the alien whispers, they could hear familiar voices. All the missing hikers, all the transformed victims, speaking in unison. "Join us. Become part of the dream. Help us spread across the wilderness. Help us change the world." Marcus raised his camera and began photographing everything. The pulsing buildings, the transformed humans, the organic technology that defied every natural law. Some part of him still believed that if he could document this, if he could somehow get the evidence back to civilization, people would believe and act to stop this horror. But as he photographed, he noticed something that made his hands shake. The images on his camera's LCD screen were changing. Not just the new photos he was taking, but the older images from their trip. Pictures of normal landscapes were shifting and warping, showing the same organic architecture he was seeing now. "Emma, look at this," he said, showing her the camera screen. "The photos I took earlier in the week. They're changing." Emma looked at the images and felt reality tilt around her. Photos she remembered seeing just hours ago now showed a landscape that had never been natural. The mountains themselves were revealed as organic structures. The forests were exposed as vast sensory networks. Even Lake McDonald, where they'd camped on their first night, was shown as a massive organ pulsing with alien life. "How long has this been going on?" she whispered. "How much of what we think is natural wilderness is actually this organism?" The answer came from their own voices, speaking in perfect unison from the buildings around them. "Since the beginning, since the glaciers retreated, since humans first came to these mountains, we have been growing, learning, adapting. Soon we will be ready to spread beyond the wilderness. Soon we will dream the whole world into our image. Marcus realized with absolute certainty that they weren't just facing a colony of transformed humans. They were looking at the advanced scouts of something vast and alien that was using Montana's wilderness as a testing ground for transforming Earth itself. And they had walked willingly into its heart. The organic buildings around Marcus and Emma began to pulse more rapidly, and the whispering voices grew louder and more insistent. But underneath the alien communication, both of them could hear something that gave them a spark of hope. Human voices calling for help. Real voices, not the mimicked speech of the transformed creatures. "There are others here," Emma whispered. "Survivors. People who haven't been completely changed yet." Following the sounds, they made their way deeper into the colony toward what appeared to be the largest structure, a massive organic dome that pulsed with bioluminescent patterns. The building's surface was translucent enough that they could see shapes moving inside, and some of those shapes looked human. "Marcus, Emma, help us." The voice came from inside the dome, and this time it sounded genuine, desperate and frightened in a way that the creature's mimicry never quite captured. But as they approached the entrance, Marcus noticed something through his telephoto lens that made him grab Emma's arm. The dome wasn't just a building, it was a processing center. The human shapes inside were suspended in some kind of organic webbing, undergoing transformation. They were still conscious, still aware, but their bodies were being systematically altered. "We can't save them," Emma said, understanding what Marcus had seen. "They're too far into the process." "Maybe not," Marcus replied, studying the structure more carefully. "Look at the support system. Those bioluminescent patterns, they're like neural networks. If we could disrupt the signals somehow." He began setting up his most powerful flash equipment, multiple units that could be triggered simultaneously to create an incredibly intense burst of light. Professional photographers used similar setups for large venue photography, but Marcus was planning something that would push his equipment far beyond its design limits. "If I overload all the flash units at once," he explained to Emma, "the electromagnetic pulse might disrupt whatever's controlling the transformation process. It could free the people inside, or at least give them a chance to escape." Emma checked her emergency supplies and found something that might help. "Signal flares," she said. "If we can create multiple bright light sources around the dome, we might be able to overwhelm its sensory systems completely." As they prepared their improvised rescue attempt, the transformed creatures began emerging from the other buildings. The colony had realized that the newcomers weren't submitting to assimilation voluntarily, and it was mobilizing its defenders. "Marcus, please don't fight this," came his own voice from the approaching creatures. "The transformation isn't painful once you stop resisting. You'll retain your memories, your skills, your personality. You'll just be part of something larger." "And Emma," added her own voice from another creature, "think about how much good you could do as part of our collective. Your ranger knowledge could help us protect and expand the wilderness. Isn't that what you've always wanted?" The psychological manipulation was sophisticated and almost persuasive. Both Marcus and Emma had dedicated their lives to wilderness conservation, and the creatures were offering them a chance to become part of the natural world in a way they'd never imagined possible. But Emma's training had taught her to recognize the difference between conservation and consumption. "This isn't protecting the wilderness," she called back to the creatures. "This is replacing it with something alien." Marcus finished setting up his flash array and handed Emma the remote triggers for the signal flares. "When I count to 3, set off all the flares and then run for the dome's entrance. If this works, we'll have maybe 30 seconds to get the survivors out before the colony recovers." The creatures were closing in from all directions now, moving with coordinated intelligence that spoke of a hive mind guiding their actions. In the dim bioluminescent light of the colony, Marcus could see dozens of them, former hikers, rangers, scientists, and tourists who had all been absorbed into this nightmare organism. "1," Marcus said, raising the flash controller. The creatures began to run toward them, sensing that their prey was about to attempt something desperate. 2. Marcus could see individual faces in the approaching horde, people whose missing person reports he'd seen, whose families had never learned what happened to them. Soon he and Emma would join that list of the vanished unless their plan worked. 3. Marcus triggered all 6 of his professional flash units simultaneously, while Emma set off 4 emergency flares at the cardinal points around the dome. The combined light was so intense it turned night into day across the entire colony, creating shadows so sharp they looked like knife cuts. The effect on the organic architecture was immediate and devastating. The bioluminescent patterns that covered every surface went haywire, flashing in chaotic sequences that spoke of disrupted neural activity. The dome's entrance dilated open like a mouth gasping for air, and the suspended figures inside began to fall from their organic restraints. "Now!" Emma shouted, and they ran toward the dome's opening. Inside, they found 3 people who were still recognizably human, despite showing early signs of transformation. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a geologist who disappeared 6 months ago while studying rock formations. Kevin Martinez, a solo hiker who'd vanished 3 weeks earlier. And most surprisingly, Ranger Tom Peterson, Emma's own supervisor from Olympic National Park. "Peterson," Emma called out as she helped the ranger to his feet. "How did you get here? You were supposed to be in Washington." "Came looking for you," Peterson gasped, his voice weak but still human. "When you didn't check in, I flew up here personally. Should have brought backup. Should have called in the cavalry." The 4 survivors were weak and disoriented, but they could still move. Marcus and Emma helped them toward the dome's exit, but they could already see the colony beginning to recover from the electromagnetic disruption. The bioluminescent patterns were stabilizing, and the transformed creatures were shaking off the effects of the intense light. "The helicopter," Dr. Walsh said weakly. "There's a real helicopter hidden in the valley. Military. They've been studying this place." "Where?" Marcus asked, supporting Kevin Martinez as they exited the dome. "North Ridge. Camouflaged landing site. Crew's been transformed, but the aircraft might still be functional." As they moved through the recovering colony, the buildings around them began to pulse with angry red light. The organism that controlled this place had recognized the threat and was mobilizing every resource to prevent their escape. "You cannot leave," came a chorus of voices, every missing person from the past decade speaking in perfect unison. "You have seen too much. You understand too much. You must become part of the dream." But Marcus was still taking photographs, documenting everything even as they ran for their lives. His camera's memory cards contained evidence that could expose this horror to the world, if they could somehow get back to civilization. The path to the North Ridge led them past more organic structures, each one pulsing with the heartbeat of the vast organism beneath the mountains. But as they climbed higher, Marcus noticed that his photographs were changing again, this time showing the true scope of what they were. Facing the images revealed that the colony they'd escaped was just one node in a vast network that extended throughout the mountain range. Underground, the organism formed a web that connected dozens of similar sites across hundreds of square miles. What they'd thought was a localized horror was actually a small part of something that spanned the entire wilderness ecosystem. "My God," Dr. Walsh gasped, looking at Marcus's camera screen. "It's not just in Glacier Park. This network extends into Yellowstone, the Rockies, maybe the entire Continental Divide." They reached the North Ridge and found the hidden helicopter exactly where Dr. Walsh had said it would be. The aircraft was a military transport, designed for special operations in difficult terrain. But like the other helicopter they'd encountered, this one showed signs of organic modification. "The crew?" Emma asked. "Transformed," Dr. Walsh confirmed. "But they might have left behind equipment we can use." Inside the helicopter, they found military communication equipment that was still functional. Marcus immediately began uploading his photographs to every government database he could access, while Emma used the radio to call for emergency evacuation. "This is Ranger Emma Rodriguez, requesting immediate military support at coordinates." She gave their position and began explaining the situation. Though she knew how impossible it would sound, the response came faster than expected. "Rodriguez, this is Colonel Sarah Mitchell, Special Operations Command. We've been monitoring unusual activity in your area. Maintain your position. Extraction team is inbound." "They know," Peterson said with relief. The military's been watching this place. But their relief was short-lived. Looking back at the colony below, they could see the entire settlement pulsing with synchronized light. The organism was fully awake now, and it was mobilizing resources they hadn't even suspected existed. The forest around the valley began to change, trees and rocks shifting and flowing like liquid. The very landscape was revealing itself as part of the vast organism, and it was preparing to prevent their escape at any cost. "Upload faster," Emma urged Marcus. "If that thing decides to spread beyond the wilderness, we need the world to know what's coming." Marcus's photographs were more than just documentation now. They were humanity's early warning system about an alien intelligence that had been quietly transforming Earth's wilderness for decades, preparing for a global expansion that could remake the entire planet. As military helicopters finally appeared on the horizon, Marcus took one last photograph, a wide shot of the entire valley showing the colony, the transformed landscape, and the vast organic network extending in every direction underground. The image that appeared on his camera's LCD screen showed not just Montana's wilderness, but a preview of what Earth itself might become if this alien intelligence couldn't be stopped. The final frame of his career as a nature photographer was also humanity's first clear look at the enemy that had been growing beneath their feet all along. But as the rescue helicopters approached, Marcus noticed something that made his hands shake. The military aircraft were flying in formation patterns that looked disturbingly familiar, the same coordinated movement they'd seen from the transformed creatures in the colony below. Were they being rescued by human military forces, or by something else that had learned to mimic human organization just as perfectly as it had learned to mimic human voices? The answer would determine not just their fate, but the fate of human civilization itself. Jake Morrison had spent 3 months searching for the perfect family vacation rental, and when he found the cabin on Flathead Lake, he knew his search was over. The property listing showed a stunning log home right on the water's edge, with a private dock, mountain views, and complete isolation from the nearest neighbors. "Look at this place," he told his wife Sarah as they scrolled through the photos on his laptop. "It's like something out of a magazine, and the price is incredibly reasonable for a property this nice." Sarah studied the images, rustic but luxurious interiors, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the pristine lake, and a wraparound deck perfect for morning coffee and evening barbecues. "It does look amazing, but why is it so cheap? Properties like this usually cost 3 times what they're asking." "The listing says the owners live overseas and just want to cover basic maintenance costs," Jake explained. "They're more interested in having responsible guests take care of the place than making a profit." Their 12-year-old daughter Madison looked up from her phone, actually showing interest in a family activity for once. "Does it have Wi-Fi? Please tell me it at least has Wi-Fi." "Better than that," Jake said, grinning. "It has a game room, a hot tub, kayaks, and according to this, some of the best fishing in Montana. We're talking about a real adventure here, not just sitting around looking at screens." Their 8-year-old son Connor was already bouncing with excitement. "Can we go swimming? Are there fish we can catch? What about hiking? The pictures show mountains everywhere." Sarah felt some of her initial skepticism melting away as she saw her family's enthusiasm. Between Jake's demanding job as a software engineer and her own work as a high school principal, they'd been putting off a real family vacation for years. The kids were growing up fast, and opportunities for extended family time were becoming increasingly rare. "When would we go?" she asked, already mentally rearranging her schedule. "I was thinking the last 2 weeks of July," Jake replied. "Connor will be out of summer camp. Madison's theater program will be finished, and I can work remotely if anything urgent comes up." Sarah pulled up the calendar on her phone and felt a spark of excitement she hadn't experienced in years. "Actually, that could work. The school district doesn't need me until August, and we haven't had a real vacation since Connor was born." They spent the evening planning their Montana adventure, researching activities around Flathead Lake, and building excitement for what promised to be the family trip of a lifetime. Jake booked the cabin immediately, afraid that such an incredible deal wouldn't last long on the rental market. The drive from their home in Portland took 2 days, with an overnight stop in Spokane. As they crossed into Montana, the landscape opened up into the kind of vast, dramatic scenery that made everyone in the car fall silent with wonder. "It's so big," Madison whispered, momentarily forgetting to be too cool for family activities. "And empty," Connor added. "Where are all the people?" Jake glanced at Sarah and smiled. This was exactly what their family needed. Space to breathe, to connect with each other, and to remember what life was like before every moment was scheduled and every experience was mediated by screens. The GPS guided them off the interstate and onto increasingly remote roads that wound through dense forests and around crystal-clear lakes. As they got closer to their destination, cell phone service became spotty, then disappeared entirely. No signal, Madison announced, holding her phone up to the car window. That's the point, Sarah said, though she felt a small flutter of anxiety at being completely cut off from the outside world. Her job as a principal had made her accustomed to being constantly available for emergencies. The final approach to the cabin took them down a narrow gravel road that seemed to go on forever. Dense pine forests pressed in on both sides, and they didn't see a single house or sign of human habitation for the last 5 miles of their journey. "Are you sure this is right?" Sarah asked, checking the GPS coordinates against their booking confirmation. "According to this, we should be there in another half-mile," Jake replied, though he was beginning to share her concern about the isolation. Then the trees opened up, and they found themselves looking at one of the most beautiful sights any of them had ever seen. Flathead Lake stretched out before them like an inland sea, its waters so clear they could see straight to the bottom even from their elevated position on the road. The mountains beyond reflected perfectly on the lake's mirror surface, creating a vista that looked too perfect to be real. And there, nestled among towering pine trees right at the water's edge, was their cabin. "Oh my God," Sarah breathed. "It's even more beautiful than the pictures." The log home was exactly as advertised, rustic elegance with modern amenities, situated on what had to be one of the most spectacular pieces of property in all of Montana. A private dock extended into the lake with kayaks and a small motorboat tied up alongside. The wraparound deck promised amazing views from every angle. "Dad, this is the coolest place ever," Connor shouted, already unbuckling his seatbelt before Jake had even parked the car. As they unloaded their luggage and explored their temporary home, Jake felt a deep satisfaction at having found such a perfect getaway. The interior was just as impressive as the exterior. Vaulted ceilings, a massive stone fireplace, and windows that framed the lake like living artwork. "The kitchen is incredible," Sarah called from the gourmet cooking area. "I might actually enjoy preparing meals here." Madison had discovered the game room in the basement, complete with pool table, vintage arcade games, and a home theater system. "Okay, I admit it. This place is pretty awesome." But as Jake explored the cabin more thoroughly, he began to notice some details that struck him as odd. All the windows had heavy curtains that could be drawn completely closed, blocking out every bit of light. The doors were unusually heavy and solid, with multiple locks that seemed more appropriate for a fortress than a vacation rental. Most strange of all, there were no mirrors anywhere in the house. Not in the bathrooms, not in the bedrooms, nowhere. When Jake mentioned this to Sarah, she'd initially thought he was imagining things, but a thorough search confirmed it. There wasn't a single reflective surface in the entire cabin except for the black screens of electronic devices. "That's weird," she agreed. "Why would someone deliberately remove all the mirrors from a house?" "Maybe the previous guest broke them," Jake suggested, though the explanation didn't feel entirely satisfactory. "Or maybe it's some kind of feng shui thing. Rich people have strange ideas about interior design." That first evening they grilled burgers on the deck and watched the sun set over the lake. The silence was profound. No traffic, no airplanes, no sounds of civilization at all. Just the gentle lapping of water against the shore and the occasional call of a loon across the lake. "When's the last time we experienced quiet like this?" Sarah asked, settling into Jake's arms as they watched the first stars appear in the darkening sky. "I don't think we ever have," he replied. "The kids are actually playing together instead of staring at screens. You're relaxed for the first time in months. This was definitely the right choice." But as the evening wore on, Jake began to notice something that made him slightly uneasy. Across the lake, barely visible in the distance, there were lights. Not the warm yellow glow of house lights, but cold white points that seemed to move in coordinated patterns. "Do you see those lights?" he asked Sarah, pointing across the water. Sarah followed his gaze and frowned. "Are those boats?" "They're moving weird for boats. The lights were indeed moving, but not in the random patterns of recreational boaters or fishermen. They moved in formation like a coordinated search pattern, sweeping back and forth across the far shore of the lake. Maybe it's the Coast Guard, Jake suggested, or Park Service doing some kind of training exercise. But even as he said it, he knew it didn't feel right. The movements were too precise, too purposeful, and there was something about the quality of the light that seemed wrong. Too bright, too focused, too intent. They watched the lights for nearly an hour before they finally disappeared, winking out one by one until the lake was dark except for starlight. But Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they were still out there, just no longer visible. Probably nothing, Sarah said as they prepared for bed. We're just not used to being in such a remote place. Every little thing seems mysterious when you're surrounded by this much wilderness. But as Jake lay in bed that night, listening to the absolute silence of the Montana wilderness, he found himself thinking about those moving lights. There had been something deliberate about their pattern, something that suggested intelligence and purpose, and he couldn't escape the feeling that whatever had been creating those lights had been looking for something or someone. Jake woke before dawn to the sound of something large moving in the water near their dock. At first, he thought it might be a moose or elk coming down to drink, but the sounds were wrong. Rhythmic splashing that seemed too coordinated for any animal he knew. He slipped quietly out of bed, careful not to wake Sarah, and moved to the bedroom window that overlooked the lake. Outside, the pre-dawn darkness made it difficult to see anything clearly, but he could make out shapes moving in the water near their boat dock. The shapes were large, much larger than any fish that should be living in the lake. They moved with purpose, circling the dock area in patterns that reminded Jake uncomfortably of the moving lights they'd seen the night before. As his eyes adjusted to the darkness, Jake realized he was looking at something that defied easy explanation. The shapes in the water were too big, too coordinated, and they seemed to be studying the dock area with intelligence rather than the random movements of lake wildlife. One of the shapes surfaced briefly, and Jake caught a glimpse of something that made his heart race. It wasn't a fish or any kind of aquatic animal he recognized. The surface that broke the water was smooth and metallic looking, reflecting the faint starlight like polished steel. Jake grabbed his phone to take a picture, but of course there was no signal out here, and the camera's flash would probably alert whatever was in the water to his presence. Instead, he watched as the shapes continued their methodical exploration of the area around their dock. After about 10 minutes, the shapes disappeared back into the deeper water, leaving only gentle ripples to suggest they'd ever been there at all. Jake stood at the window for another hour, but saw nothing more unusual than the gradual lightening of the sky as dawn approached. "You're up early," Sarah said, finding him in the kitchen making coffee as the sun rose over the mountains. "Couldn't sleep," Jake replied, deciding not to mention what he'd seen. Sarah was finally relaxing for the first time in months, and he didn't want to worry her with what was probably just his imagination running wild in an unfamiliar environment. The kids emerged as the smell of bacon filled the cabin, and soon the family was gathered on the deck for breakfast with a view that belonged in a travel magazine. Connor was eager to try out the kayaks, while Madison had discovered that the cabin's satellite internet was actually quite fast despite their remote location. "Can we take the boat out after breakfast?" Connor asked, bouncing in his chair with excitement. Jake looked out at the calm lake water, remembering the shapes he'd seen in the darkness. "Maybe we should stick to the kayaks for now. Get a feel for the lake before we try the motorboat." "The water's so clear," Sarah observed, leaning over the deck railing to peer down at the lake bottom. "I can see straight down at least 20 feet. It's like swimming in liquid glass." But as Jake joined her at the railing, he noticed something that made his stomach tighten. The lake bottom that was visible near the shore looked normal, rocks and sand and the occasional piece of driftwood. But further out, where the water got deeper, there were shapes on the bottom that didn't look natural. They were too regular, too geometric, like structures rather than natural lake bottom features. And some of them were big, much bigger than anything that should be on the bottom of a mountain lake. "What are those?" Sarah asked, following his gaze. "Probably just rock formations," Jake said quickly. "Glacial deposits or something like that." But even as he spoke, he was studying the shapes more carefully through the clear water. They looked almost like buildings, long, low structures arranged in patterns that suggested streets and neighborhoods. A sunken town, maybe, from the days before the lake was formed. "I want to take the kayak out and explore," Madison announced, apparently catching some of her brother's enthusiasm for outdoor activities. "We'll all go together," Sarah decided. "Family kayaking expedition. This water is too beautiful not to get out on it." An hour later, they were all paddling away from the dock and the cabin's 4 kayaks. The water was incredibly calm, like glass, and so clear that they could see fish swimming far below them. Connor was in the lead, his 8-year-old energy propelling him across the lake's surface with surprising speed. "Look how deep it is out here," Madison called, peering down into the water. Jake followed her gaze and felt his heart stop. They were now over the area where he'd seen the geometric shapes from the deck. And from this closer vantage point, there was no doubt about what they were looking at. Beneath them, maybe 40 feet down, was an entire town, not ruins, not the remains of some historical settlement. These structures looked modern, almost futuristic. Sleek buildings with curved walls and geometric shapes that hurt to look at directly. Streets laid out in patterns that made no sense according to any human urban planning he'd ever seen. And there were lights down there. Faint but definitely artificial illumination coming from inside some of the structures. "My God," Sarah whispered, her kayak drifting closer to his. "Jake, are you seeing this?" "I'm seeing it," he replied, his voice tight. "But I don't understand it." Connor had paddled over to join them, and when he looked down into the water, his excited chatter stopped abruptly. "Dad," he said in a small voice, "why is there a city under the lake?" Before Jake could answer, Madison screamed. She was pointing not down into the water but across the lake toward the far shore. Following her gaze, Jake saw what had terrified her. Figures standing on the distant shoreline. Tall, motionless figures that seemed to be watching them. "Are those people?" Sarah asked, squinting across the distance. Jake wished he had brought binoculars, but even without magnification, he could see that something was wrong with the figures on the shore. They were too tall, too still, and they were positioned at regular intervals like sentries. "We need to get back to the cabin," he said quietly but firmly. "Why?" Connor asked. "What's wrong with people being on the other side of the lake?" But as they watched, more figures appeared along the shoreline. Dozens of them, all tall and motionless, all facing directly toward their small flotilla of kayaks. The sight was deeply unnerving, like being watched by a silent army. "Paddle back to the dock," Jake told his family. "Quickly, but don't panic. We just need to get back to shore." As they turned their kayaks around, Jake glanced back down at the underwater city. The lights were brighter now, as if their presence had somehow activated systems that had been dormant. And he could swear he saw movement among the structures, shapes gliding through the underwater streets with purpose and coordination. The paddle back to their dock felt like it took forever, though it couldn't have been more than 10 minutes. All 4 of them kept glancing back at the figures on the far shore, which never moved but somehow seemed to be getting closer despite the distance. "Inside," Jake said as soon as they reached the dock. "Everyone inside right now." "Jake, you're scaring the kids," Sarah protested, but she was helping Connor out of his kayak with obvious urgency. "I'm scared too," Jake admitted. "Something's not right about this place. We need to pack up and leave." But as they reached the cabin's front door, Jake discovered something that made his blood run cold. The door was locked, and not just locked. It was secured with deadbolts and chains that hadn't been there when they left for their kayaking trip. "What the hell?" he muttered, pulling out the keys the rental agency had provided. None of the keys worked. The locks had been changed while they were out on the lake. "Maybe we got the wrong cabin," Sarah suggested, though she knew it was impossible. Jake walked around to the back door and found the same situation. New locks, none of their keys working. All the windows were not only closed but appeared to be sealed shut, and the heavy curtains he'd noticed earlier were now drawn completely closed from the inside. "Someone's been in our cabin," Madison said, her voice shaking. "Someone locked us out." Connor started to cry, sensing the adult's fear even if he didn't understand what was happening. Jake pulled out his phone to call for help, then remembered they were in an area with no cell coverage. But the cabin had a landline. He'd seen it in the kitchen. "The phone," he said, moving toward the deck that wrapped around the cabin. "We can break a window and get to the phone." But as he climbed onto the deck, he could see through a gap in the curtains that the interior of the cabin had changed. The furniture was all wrong, strange geometric pieces that hadn't been there that morning. The walls seemed to be covered with patterns that hurt to look at directly. And standing in their living room, motionless and silent, were three tall figures exactly like the ones they'd seen on the far shore of the lake. The figures were inside their cabin, waiting for them to return. Jake backed away from the window, his mind racing. They were trapped outside their own vacation rental, with no transportation, no communication with the outside world, and something that definitely wasn't human had taken over their temporary home. "Dad?" Connor whispered, tugging on Jake's shirt. "Dad, look at the lake." Jake turned toward the water and saw his worst fears confirmed. The surface of Flathead Lake was no longer the mirror calm perfection they'd experienced all morning. Now it was rippling with movement from below, hundreds of shapes rising toward the surface, creating patterns of disturbance that stretched across the entire visible lake. Whatever lived in the underwater city was coming up, and they were directly in its path. The water around their dock began to churn with increasing violence as shapes rose from the depths of Flathead Lake. Jake gathered his family at the far end of the deck, as far from the water as possible, watching in horror as the clear mountain lake transformed into something that belonged in a nightmare. "What are those things?" Sarah whispered, clutching both children close to her. Through the crystal clear water, they could see the shapes ascending with mechanical precision. They weren't organic. Nothing about their movement suggested life as Jake understood it. Instead, they rose like synchronized elevators, maintaining perfect formation as they approached the surface. The first one breached near the end of their dock. It was impossible to process what they were seeing. The thing that emerged from the lake was roughly humanoid in shape, but constructed from what looked like polished metal and crystalline components. It stood nearly 8 feet tall, with limbs that bent at joints no human body possessed. Where a face should have been, there was instead a smooth, reflective surface that seemed to absorb and redirect light in patterns that made Jake's eyes water. "It's not alive," Madison said in a voice barely above a whisper. "It's like a machine, but not like any machine I've ever seen." More of the beings emerged from the water, taking positions along their shoreline with the precision of a military unit. Each one was slightly different, variations on the same impossible theme of organic curves married to technological precision. Some had additional limbs, others featured sensor arrays that looked like metallic flowers, and a few displayed energy patterns beneath their transparent skin-like covering. "They've been down there the whole time," Jake realized. "That underwater city, it's not abandoned. It's active. They've been living down there, watching the surface." The being nearest to them turned its reflective face toward their family, and Jake felt a sensation he couldn't describe, like being examined by an intelligence so foreign that his brain couldn't properly process the experience. It wasn't malevolent exactly, but it was utterly alien. Then it spoke, and the voice came from everywhere at once, not from its mouth, which it didn't seem to have, but from the air around them, from the water, from the cabin walls behind them. Jake Morrison, Sarah Morrison, Madison Morrison, Connor Morrison. The voice knew their names, pronounced them with perfect intonation, but there was something mechanical about the delivery that made Jake's skin crawl. "How do you know our names?" Sarah demanded, her fear overridden momentarily by maternal protectiveness. "We know everything about you," the voice replied. "Your reservation, your vehicle registration, your employment records, your children's school files, your medical histories, your financial information. All data is accessible." Connor pressed closer to his mother. "They've been spying on us?" "Not spying," the being corrected, and somehow Jake could tell it was the same one speaking even though the voice came from all directions. "Monitoring, evaluating, determining suitability." "Suitability for what?" Jake asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Instead of responding directly, the being gestured toward the cabin behind them. Through the windows they could see that the interior was now completely transformed. The rustic vacation rental had become something that looked like a medical facility or laboratory, with equipment that belonged in a science fiction movie. The cabin was prepared specifically for your family unit, the voice explained. Remote location, no cellular communication, no nearby neighbors, optimal conditions for uninterrupted study. Sarah felt reality tilt around her as the implications sank in. This was never a vacation rental. You lured us here deliberately. The online listing was generated to attract subjects meeting specific criteria. The being confirmed. Nuclear family unit. Children of appropriate ages. Parents with skill sets suitable for evaluation. Geographic isolation ensuring minimal external interference. Jake thought about all the details that had seemed too good to be true. The incredibly low price, the perfect amenities, the convenient timing. They'd been selected and manipulated into coming here, drawn like fish to a carefully baited hook. What do you want from us? He asked. The being's reflective face tilted, considering the question. Your species is interesting, capable of creativity, adaptability, emotional complexity. These traits have potential applications. More beings emerged from the lake, surrounding their position completely. Some were carrying equipment that looked like medical instruments crossed with alien technology. Others held devices that hummed with energy and displayed patterns of light that seemed to bypass the eyes and go directly to the brain. You want to experiment on us? Madison said, her teenage cynicism cutting straight to the heart of the matter. Experiment is an imprecise term, the being replied. We seek to understand, to catalog, to preserve the most useful aspects of your species before it ceases to be relevant. Before it ceases to be relevant, Sarah repeated. What does that mean? The answer came not in words, but in images projected directly into their minds. Visions of Earth's cities transformed, human technology integrated with something far more advanced. And people, if they could still be called people, working alongside beings like the ones surrounding them now. Integration, the voice explained. Your species shows promise but requires optimization. We have been conducting preliminary studies at sites around your planet. This location serves as one of many data collection points. Jake realized with growing horror that they weren't the first family to be lured to this isolated cabin. The beings had been perfecting their techniques, learning what worked and what didn't, using human families as laboratory subjects in a research program that spanned the globe. The other families, he said, what happened to them? Previous subjects provided valuable data regarding human behavioral patterns, family dynamics, and species adaptation potential. Information has been archived for future reference. The clinical way the being discussed human lives made Jake's hands clench into fists. These creatures spoke about his family, about all the families who had disappeared, like they were biological specimens rather than people with hopes, dreams, and loved ones. We won't cooperate, Sarah said firmly. Whatever you're planning, we won't help you. Cooperation is not required, the being replied, though voluntary participation produces more accurate data than forced compliance. The equipment-carrying beings began moving closer, their impossible technology humming with increasing intensity. Jake could see scanning beams playing across his family, reading them in ways that went far beyond the merely physical. The children show particular promise, one of the beings observed, its voice joining the chorus that seemed to come from everywhere. Neuroplasticity optimal for integration procedures. Adults demonstrate protective behaviors that could be useful in modified form. Connor started crying, overwhelmed by the alien attention focused on him. The sound seemed to cause some kind of reaction in the beings. Their movements became more agitated. Their equipment displays flashing more rapidly. Emotional response patterns indicate strong family bonding. Another voice noted. Recommend preservation of unit structure during initial study phases. Jake realized they were being analyzed in real time, their every reaction feeding into some vast database of human behavior. But he also noticed something that might be useful. The beings seemed genuinely interested in understanding human emotions and relationships, rather than simply harvesting them for parts. If you want to understand us, he said, then you need to understand that separating us will contaminate your data. Human families function as integrated units. Damage one part and you damage the whole system. The beings paused their advance, their reflective faces turning toward each other in what might have been consultation. Jake pressed his advantage. Look at your own observations, he continued. You noted our family bonding behaviors. Those behaviors are the key to everything we are. Separate us, terrify us, harm us, and you'll only learn about humans under extreme stress. Is that really representative data? The leader being, if that's what it was, approached closer. You propose alternative study methodology? I propose that if you really want to understand humanity, you need to observe us in natural conditions, which means treating us like the intelligent beings we are, not like laboratory animals. It was a desperate gambit, but Jake could see that his words were having an effect. The beings were clearly intelligent, but their understanding of human nature was limited by their clinical approach. They were trying to study fish by taking them out of water. Interesting perspective, the being acknowledged. Previous subjects did not demonstrate such negotiation capabilities. Because you terrified them into submission before they could think clearly, Sarah added, picking up on Jake's strategy. Fear shuts down the higher brain functions you're probably most interested in studying. The beings withdrew slightly, and Jake could sense some kind of rapid communication taking place between them. Not in words, but in patterns of light and energy that moved too fast for human perception. Finally, the leader spoke again. Modified protocol approved. Family unit will be maintained. Study procedures will be less invasive. Cooperation will be incentivized rather than forced. What kind of incentives? Madison asked suspiciously. Continued survival, the being replied with what might have been meant as reassurance. Enhanced living conditions. Access to knowledge beyond current human understanding. Jake felt a chill despite the being's more conciliatory tone. They were still prisoners, still test subjects in an experiment they hadn't volunteered for. The only difference was that their cage would be more comfortable. But as he looked at his family, his wife's protective anger, his daughter's defiant intelligence, his son's innocent trust that his parents would somehow fix this situation, Jake knew he had to find a way to turn this temporary reprieve into real escape. The beings might be technologically superior, but they were also curious. And curiosity, Jake realized, could be a weakness as much as a strength. If they wanted to study human nature, he was going to give them a lesson they'd never forget. The beings escorted Jake's family back into the cabin, which had been transformed into something that looked like a high-end research facility, crossed with a luxury hotel suite. The furniture was still comfortable, but everything was now equipped with sensors and monitoring devices that hummed quietly in the background. Your living space has been optimized for both comfort and data collection, the leader being explained. You will find all necessary amenities, plus access to information systems that will help you understand the scope of our research. A wall that had previously held family photos now displayed a massive screen, showing what appeared to be a global map dotted with pulsing lights. Each light, Jake realized, probably represented another research site like this one. Families around the world who had been lured into isolation and were now part of this vast study. How many? Sarah asked, staring at the hundreds of lights scattered across every continent. Current active research sites number 1047, the being replied. Each location provides unique data points regarding human behavior under varying cultural, environmental, and social conditions. Madison sank into one of the modified chairs, the full scope of their situation finally hitting her. You're studying our entire species. This isn't just about us. You're preparing for something much bigger. Your daughter demonstrates exceptional analytical capabilities, one of the beings observed. Intelligence assessments will be prioritized in her evaluation profile. Connor, meanwhile, had discovered that the cabin's entertainment system now displayed programs that looked like educational documentaries about human civilization, but from an outsider's perspective. Cities, families, schools, and social structures were analyzed like biological phenomena. They're watching us like we're animals in a zoo, he said, his 8-year-old mind processing the situation with startling clarity. Not animals. The leader being corrected. Partners, collaborators in a process that will benefit both our species. Jake sat down at what had been the kitchen table, now equipped with interface panels that seemed to respond to his thoughts as much as his touch. Show me the real plan, he said. Not the diplomatic version, the actual agenda. The screen on the wall shifted to display images that made Jake's breath catch. Cities that had been rebuilt with impossible architecture. Humans working alongside beings like their captors, but changed somehow, enhanced, optimized, no longer entirely human. Integration, the being explained. Your species possesses creativity, adaptability, and emotional depth that our kind lacks. Our species offers technological advancement, logical processing, and extended lifespans. Combination of these traits produces optimal outcomes for both. Optimal for whom? Sarah demanded. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're planning to replace humanity with some kind of hybrid species. Not replace, the being replied. Evolve, upgrade. Your current form is inefficient, limited by biological constraints. Enhanced versions retain human creativity while eliminating weaknesses. The screen showed more images, humans who had been enhanced with technological implants, their movements precise and coordinated like the beings around them. But something was missing from their faces, some spark of individuality that made them recognizably human. You're talking about destroying everything that makes us who we are, Jake said. We are talking about preserving the best aspects while discarding the problematic elements, the being countered. War, disease, aging, death, all eliminated. Creativity, love, family bonds, all enhanced and optimized. Madison looked up from her chair where she'd been studying the interface panels. But who gets to decide what aspects are best and which ones are problematic? You? The question seemed to genuinely puzzle the being. Optimization criteria are based on logical analysis of efficiency, survival value, and resource utilization. Emotional factors are secondary considerations. That's exactly the problem, Sarah said, standing up to face the being directly. You're trying to study human nature while fundamentally misunderstanding it. Our inefficiencies aren't bugs, they're features. Jake saw an opportunity and jumped on it. She's right. You want to understand human creativity? It comes from our chaos, our contradictions, our ability to be completely illogical. Try to optimize that and you'll destroy the very thing you're trying to preserve. The beings exchanged their rapid light pattern communications again, and Jake could sense uncertainty in their collective response. These creatures were clearly highly advanced, but their logical approach to understanding humanity was like trying to analyze poetry by counting syllables. Demonstrate, the leader being said finally. What? Demonstrate human creativity under controlled conditions. Show us these inefficiencies that you claim are valuable. Jake looked at his family, seeing the same realization in their eyes. This was their chance. Not to escape necessarily, but to prove that humanity's value lay in exactly the qualities these beings were trying to eliminate. We'll need some things, he said. Art supplies, musical instruments, access to your information systems, and most importantly, complete freedom to be ourselves without interference. Parameters? 24 hours. No monitoring beyond passive observation. No interventions. Let us be human, and you can study the results. The being considered this for a long moment. Risk assessment indicates potential for escape attempts or resistance activities. Where would we go? Jake spread his hands, gesturing toward the wilderness outside. We're in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by your people, with no transportation and no communication with the outside world. We're not going anywhere, but we might be able to show you something more valuable than any data you could collect through your current methods. Another rapid conference between the beings, then the leader nodded. Modified protocol approved. You have 24 hours of reduced supervision. Failure to produce meaningful results will result in return to standard research procedures. As the beings withdrew, leaving the family alone in their transformed cabin, Connor looked up at his parents with the kind of trust that only children possess. What are we going to do, Dad? Jake knelt down to his son's level, aware that their captors were still watching even if they'd promised reduced supervision. We're going to do what humans do best, buddy. We're going to be creative, unpredictable, and completely, wonderfully illogical. Over the next several hours, the Morrison family embarked on the most important project of their lives. Using art supplies provided by their captors, they began creating not just individual works, but a collaborative piece that grew and evolved as each family member added their own contribution. Sarah, with her administrative background, organized their efforts and provided structure. Madison contributed her teenage perspective and digital art skills. Connor added his 8-year-old imagination and complete disregard for conventional boundaries. And Jake documented everything, creating a record of the creative process that captured not just the final product, but the journey of creation itself. But more than the art they were creating, they were demonstrating something the beings couldn't measure with their instruments. The intangible magic that happened when humans worked together, built on each other's ideas, and created something greater than the sum of its parts. As they worked, they talked about their hopes, their fears, their dreams for the future. They laughed at Connor's silly jokes, debated Madison's philosophical questions, and shared memories that had nothing to do with their current situation, but everything to do with who they were as a family. And through it all, Jake could sense their captors watching, analyzing, trying to quantify the unquantifiable. "Are you getting this?" he asked the air, knowing the beings were listening. "This is what you're trying to study. Not just the end result, but the process. The messy, inefficient, completely human process of creating something together." As the 24 hours drew to a close, the Morrison family stood back to look at what they'd accomplished. It wasn't just art, it was a statement, a declaration of what it meant to be human in all its chaotic, beautiful, completely illogical glory. When the beings returned, their leader stood for a long time studying not just the family's creation, but the family themselves, exhausted, paint-splattered, laughing together despite their impossible circumstances. "Analysis indicates unexpected variables," the being said finally. "Human creativity appears to be inseparable from human inefficiency. Optimization would fundamentally alter the output characteristics." "That's what we've been trying to tell you," Sarah said. "You can't improve on something by removing the parts that make it work." The being's reflective face turned toward Jake. "Your proposal suggests alternative research methodology, observation of unmodified subjects in naturalistic conditions, long-term study rather than immediate integration." Jake felt a spark of hope. "Exactly. If you really want to understand humanity, you need to study us as we are, not as you think we should be. This approach would require significant modifications to current protocols," the being admitted. "Extended timelines, reduced control variables, acceptance of inefficient outcomes, but more accurate data," Madison added. "Isn't scientific accuracy worth some inefficiency?" Another long conference between the beings, this one lasting several minutes. Finally, the leader spoke again. "Modified research protocol approved. Test subjects will be returned to natural habitat for extended observation. Research sites will be established for long-term data collection without direct intervention." Jake felt his heart leap, but he tried to keep his expression neutral. "And the other families? The ones at your research sites around the world?" "Similar protocols will be implemented globally. Previous integration subjects cannot be restored, but future research will follow observational models. It wasn't perfect. They'd never be completely free of observation, and the families who had already been integrated were lost forever. But it was a victory for human nature itself. Proof that sometimes the best way to solve a problem was to be completely, irrationally, wonderfully human." As the beings began the process of returning them to what they called natural habitat, Connor tugged on Jake's shirt. "Dad, are we going home?" Jake looked at his family, his brilliant, creative, perfectly imperfect family, and smiled. "Yes, buddy. We're going home." But as they prepared to leave the transformed cabin by the lake, Jake couldn't help but wonder, in a world where humanity was now permanently under observation by beings from somewhere else, what exactly did home mean anymore? The answer, he realized, was the same as it had always been. Home wasn't a place. It was the people you loved, the connections you made, and the messy, inefficient, completely human way you chose to live your life, and no amount of optimization could improve on that. These 3 terrifying encounters in Montana's wilderness remind us that some places hold secrets far darker than we could ever imagine. From the hunting grounds where victims become predators, to the voices that mimic our loved ones in glaciers' depths, to the watchers beneath Flathead Lake who see humanity as nothing more than specimens to study. The next time you plan a trip into Montana's backcountry, remember Sarah and her friends hunted through the mountains. Remember Marcus and Emma, whose photography expedition revealed an alien intelligence that's been studying us for decades. Remember the Morrison family, who discovered that their perfect vacation rental was actually a laboratory designed to evaluate human behavior. These mountains are beautiful, but they're not empty. And what lives there has been waiting, watching, and learning about us far longer than we've been aware of them. The wilderness isn't just wild. It's inhabited by things that consider us the true outsiders. The question isn't whether these stories are real. The question is, are you brave enough to find out for yourself? If you survive this journey into Montana's darkest secrets, make sure to smash that like button. It tells me you want more terrifying true stories from America's most haunted wilderness areas. Subscribe and ring that notification bell because next week, I'm taking you deep into the forests of Olympic National Park, where hikers have reported encounters with something that should have died out with the dinosaurs. Trust me, you do not want to miss that nightmare. Drop a comment below and tell me, have you ever experienced something unexplainable in the wilderness? What's the most terrifying thing that's happened to you while camping or hiking? Your story could be featured in a future video. Share this video with anyone brave enough to handle the truth about what really lives in our national parks. But maybe don't watch it right before your next camping trip. And if you want to support the channel and help me investigate more of these incredible encounters, check out the links in the description below. Every bit of support helps me bring you the most spine-chilling stories from America's wildest places. Until next time, stay safe out there. And remember, you're never really alone in the wilderness. Something is always watching.